Hello, and on behalf of Grant Thornton, a warm welcome to this live broadcast, where today we are discussing how you can find value in sustainable supply chains. My name is Nadine Dereza, and I'm really looking forward to chairing and hosting this live event. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a panel of experts from UK Grant Thornton, and also representing all around the world as well. I know we'll be talking to them in just a moment about their experiences, and also an interesting fact that you may not know about them too. Now, briefly, my background is that I'm a business presenter and journalist, and I've worked for so many publications and broadcasters over the years. And I've also chaired numerous discussions around supply chains for a variety of sectors, right from petrochemical through to education and transport and everything else in between. And without obviously stating the obvious, what I've noticed since I've started reporting on the issue is that supply chains have changed dramatically, particularly over the last couple of years, and will carry on doing so whether we like it or not. Now, whether you're a CFO, a financial director, or maybe you're head of internal audit, or maybe a sustainability director or a non-exec director, or just have a business interest in sustainability, it's really important that you find opportunities in your supply chain in order to create value for your business. And that's really what we're going to be discussing today. Now, in terms of how this webinar is going to work, after I've asked questions of the speakers, of the panelists, I'll be putting your questions to them as well. And that means that you can submit your questions throughout the entire event using Slido, and the details should be on the screen now. So please send in your questions and comments, and I will endeavour to get through as many questions as I can, time permitting. Now, if you'd like to direct a question or comment to a particular speaker, then if you put their name down alongside the question, that would be of great help. And also, any acronyms that aren't necessarily familiar to the audience, please spell out your abbreviations. We also have a couple of polling questions that we're going to be getting you to answer throughout the broadcast. More about the polls later on. Well, I think it's now time to meet our panel. So a warm welcome to Ollie, Raj, Dan and Jackie. Ollie, if I can start with you. Ollie Bridge, who's Head of Operational Consulting for Grant Thornton. Great to have you on the programme. So tell us a bit about yourself, and also an interesting fact, Ollie.
Brilliant. So I lead up the operational consulting team for Grant Thornton. We primarily work with supply chains and manufacturing businesses, so we've seen lots of change over the last couple of years. Interesting fact, so I once spent probably 8 hours on a flight with Rita Ora. I sat next to her. I had no idea who she was the whole flight, and I've still got no idea today.
Lovely to have you here. And next up, Jackie Griffiths, lead for People Culture and ESG for Business Risk Services. Jackie, we've worked together before, so lovely to see you again.
Thank you, and great to have you here hosting us today. So I lead our ESG practice, providing risk and assurance services to our large and complex corporate clients, looking at their people risks, culture risks internally in terms of social impact, and then looking externally at how supply chains are run in terms of ethical supply chains. So we do a whole array of activities in the ESG landscape, helping clients across wherever they are on their ESG maturity.
And an interesting fact, I'm sure you've got one, Jackie.
I have many, but one I think I can share is I raised back in 2011 £200,000 for Macmillan Cancer Trust with 30 people. As part of that, walking up Kilimanjaro. But the big thing in terms of relevance for today is that it helped me understand the social impact of individuals doing charity activity to help an organisation, which opened my eyes to the ESG world.
Raj Kumar, lovely to have you on the show as well, Head of Environmental Advisory at Grant Thornton. So again, a little bit about yourself and an interesting fact.
Yeah, okay. So, with Grant Thornton, I'm helping organisations and working closely with organisations across multiple sectors, looking at their environmental, their sustainability targets, helping them develop their targets as well, across multiple sectors. Which I'll go through in a bit more detail, but an interesting fact for me, I've recently taken up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the reason why I took that up was because my 9-year-old daughter almost submitted me and literally almost brought me to unconsciousness. Okay, and I thought maybe when she's older, I need to learn those skills as well.
So actually, I'm quite scared of sitting next to him. I don't know about you, Dan. Luckily, I'm in between the pair of us, so I don't know if I'm lucky at all. Dan Dickinson, lovely to have you on the programme as well. Tax partner for Grant Thornton. Same to you.
No, thank you. Yeah, I'm not really the head of anything, but like everybody else, I'm an international tax partner by trade. So, spent 20-odd years helping multinational businesses with their global footprint, making sure that they understand their tax obligations globally and that they're paying the right amount of tax. I'm now also the firm's tax representative on our ESG steering committee. So, essentially, with all these guys, making sure that we're bringing all the value we can to multinational businesses on their ESG journey. So it's great to be here this morning.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And have you got an interesting fact?
Yeah. I mean, I could have used Raj maybe to help me. I spent a good few years working in Asia, and I was once part of a team supporting David Cameron, the government at the time, on a trade mission to the region and China in particular. And we were there was a team photo, and I was late as always, and I came in, and there was a nice space for me to stand in. I didn't quite realise that everybody else was just ready for the photo. They were all in their power poses and all that, and I thought, that's a good space to stand in. I'll just get in there. And then I heard a kind of audible from the civil servants, and then the second later, the David Cameron security detail kind of picked me up and put me to the back of the photo, like, unceremoniously. He then did his kind of smiley, I'm really tall and confident thing, and then just wandered off, and I was just left.
Well, at least you still got in the photo, though.
I did. I was kind of a floating head at the back.
Yes, which they edited out later on. But,
no, they didn't.
These are brilliant facts. Well, welcome to the panel. So there you go. That's our panellists today. And before actually we get into the discussion, among other things, we'll be talking about the new Business Outlook Tracker research, which focuses on the mid-market, which is undertaken by Grant Thornton, which I'm sure many of you are aware of because you've taken part in that research. So let's show you a video, first of all, which encapsulates some of those research results from that latest survey. Here it is.
Following a particularly disruptive few years, more than half of businesses think it's harder to operate today than it was 12 months ago. During the spring statement, the Chancellor warned that businesses should prepare for the economic environment to worsen, potentially significantly. We spoke to the mid-market to ask their thoughts on supply chains. Nearly half of businesses agree that they did not have a good enough understanding of their business's supply chain to be able to respond quickly to the disruption seen over the last 12 months. Global geopolitical challenges will likely further impact organisations already grappling with Brexit, ongoing COVID-19 disruption, and rising input costs. Our research suggests that the majority of businesses may have to pass these increasing costs in their supply chain onto consumers through higher prices for their products and services. As the cost of living crisis takes hold and organisations find new ways to create value, 57% of businesses believe that building a resilient and agile supply chain is a top priority. There is opportunity for the UK, with 52% agreeing that they would like to relocate more of their production or suppliers to the UK to reduce risk from their supply chain. Supply chains continue to change rapidly, and business leaders are under pressure to react, meet reporting requirements, and offset costs. To do this successfully, we've identified 4 key areas for you to focus on. This includes understanding your changing supply chain risks, managing social and reputational issues, optimizing costs, especially reducing energy usage, and finally reporting, regulation, and tax issues. Tackling these will result in an optimized supply chain that will allow you to create value, address stakeholders' ESG and supply risk concerns, and comply with increasing regulation and tax issues.
Well, it was interesting when watching that video, some of the stats that caught my attention. I've made a note of them. What's striking is that over half of businesses feel it's harder to operate today than 12 months ago, because let's face it, it's more volatile. We've got rapidly changing supply chains, and quite frankly, business leaders are under pressure at the moment to react. They are under pressure to meet those reporting requirements and also to offset those costs where possible. So really building that resilient, sustainable and agile supply chain is a top priority for many businesses, particularly when you think about those headwinds coming our way, a potential recession on the cards as well, those rising energy costs and commodity prices, as well as increased trade administration and political uncertainty. So a lot to think about, and we'll be discussing that today with you. So remember to keep those questions and comments coming in. What struck me actually when I was getting ready for this was reading some stuff that Ollie had put out. And what I particularly liked was the piece that you wrote about looking at that broader picture of supply chain, that realistically it's going to take 18 to 24 months to make any meaningful changes to your supply chain, depending, of course, on the maturity of your supply chain approach, and 12 months at least to put systems in place. So this is not a quick fix, but I'm sure we're going to discuss, actually, there are very tangible things that you can do. So we're looking for some real practical tips and advice here today. And all of that really is underpinned by that growing ESG, the environmental, social and governance agenda. And I mention about your internal ESG strategy straight up, because actually, if that's not in place, if that's not in order, then your supply chain is going to be a long way off as well. So we're going to help you look at ways to build that resilient, sustainable and report-ready supply chain, where we're primarily focusing on the mid-market. And on that note, I have the first polling question for you to think about, which you should be seeing on your screens now. And the polling question is as follows. If you've made ESG-focused agenda strategy changes to your supply chain, what has been the financial impact on your business? So I'll read that question out again. If you've made ESG-focused agenda strategy changes to your supply chain, what has been the financial impact on your business? We've got 5 responses to choose from. I can see some of the results already coming in, so I'll just read those through for you. Cost saving, or could it be that it's cost neutral is your option? The third response, cost increase. Maybe you're not sure, or too soon to tell. So 5 responses, and we'll come back to those results in just a couple of minutes. So actually, when you think about supply chains really over the last 10 to 20 years, and certainly since the pandemic, we've seen a real change, a real movement from, say, just-in-time, lean, low inventory supply chains to some businesses accepting a high inventory at a higher cost. So, Ollie, if I can bring you in, first of all, do you think these type of supply chain decisions, given the high amount of volatility at the moment, is actually triggering businesses to make ESG positive decisions without necessarily knowing that they are?
Yeah, it absolutely is. What we're seeing is there's a lot of volatility and unpredictable nature in the supply chains at the minute. And people are looking at their business and looking at their ESG strategy and then looking at how they can combine the two. Because an ESG strategy is really important to the whole of the supply chain. So we are seeing things like where you've got a war on talent. That's a real positive ESG agenda, because you're attracting talent and you're using some of the ESG things to bring that in. Also, reducing costs, particularly around emissions. And I know Raj will be talking about this in a bit more detail later. There's lots of ways that people are reducing cost or improving their business that actually has got a real strong ESG feel to it.
And in terms of that, though, I mean, there's all sorts of reporting requirements. I mean, the one that caught my eye, which people may not be familiar with, is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Is that something that we need to think about?
Yes, it is. So what you'll find over the next few years, 3 or less years even, is more and more legislation will be coming into the marketplace. So it will be more and more difficult to produce or manufacture and operate in general. We have seen in part of the poll that more than 50% of businesses have found it harder to operate now than it was 12 months ago because of ESG-related legislation, that's only going to get more difficult, and businesses need to prepare for that. They need to be thinking about it now, bringing in those processes and systems and being ready to for that legislation as it comes.
And many businesses are not compliant at the moment, so how worried should they be?
Not to be worried about not being compliant right now, but there is still opportunity. Businesses are working hard to become more and more compliant, and there is a lot of help out there too, of course. But we are seeing businesses trying to prioritise a lot of those issues and making sure they're bringing that compliance in as quickly as they can for the most the largest risks for their business.
And I suppose it's identifying what ESG initiatives will bring those business benefits. But how easy to say, is that harder to do though?
It depends. It depends. There are some easy wins. There are some things you can do that are that will bring in cost reductions or bring in improvements into your business, as well as having that ESG flavour. I mentioned war on talent. So looking at the level of inclusiveness, broadening your net for recruitment, it's all real social issues that you're tackling there, but also it's improving your business. Again, Raj will mention it later around cost reduction. Reducing your emissions reduces cost, improves your profitability, and also adds to your ESG agenda.
Brilliant. OK, well, let's close the poll now. Thank you very much for taking part in that. And let's have a look at the results. And Ollie, I'll get you to comment on that. And actually, the biggest proportion, over 40%, are saying too soon to tell, which is interesting, and 27% not sure. So the largest majority are really not sure about this or too soon to tell. Are you surprised by those results?
I am to an extent, and I'm not. So the too soon to tell is a theme that we are seeing, because there are businesses that are doing a lot of really good work, but maybe aren't tracking the benefits closely, or don't believe that tracking is necessary because they're doing the benefits for an ESG reason, and looking at maybe the reputational positives. What I expected to see was more cost saving.
That's 7% at the moment.
Yeah, I expected to see that a little bit higher. Our polls have suggested that's been higher, that people are getting benefit from it. And we find anecdotally when we talk to lots of businesses that there are opportunities that people are finding and working on.
And cost neutral, cost increase sharing 13% each as well. Yes,
the cost increase, I'm not surprised to see some with a cost increase. That's bound to happen because of the nature of the some of the initiatives that are being used in some businesses. However, again, for most businesses, there is opportunity to reduce cost as well.
Yeah, OK, and we'll come back to that as well. We have a second poll question for you while we're in a polling mood and before I go to Jackie. And the second polling question is, does your business consider the S in terms of social impact in your supply chain? And there's just 3 options there: yes, no, not sure. So does your business consider the S in terms of social impact in your supply chain? And Jackie, actually, I'm going to ask you a similar question, although obviously we don't want to lead the audience. Hopefully they've had the chance to answer that yes, no, not sure. So next question to you, Jackie, and do you think businesses consider the S in terms of social impact in their supply chain?
And thank you for that. I would say it's a mixed response in terms of the clients that we work with. I think picking up on what Ollie has said around the war on talent, that is a big issue that organisations are grappling with. It is a competitive market, it's an employee-led market out there, and individuals are making choices to join a company based on what they're doing in the ESG agenda. So it's about how are organisations advertising, what is the narrative around the social impact of activities that they are running within their organisation, the war on talent, the D&I initiatives that organisations are driving and grappling with, all the way through to volunteering, as I talked about in my example in terms of an important fact. It's about all the stuff that organisations are doing. How are they labelling that? What's the narrative that's internally advertised, but also externally? How do people understand what's happening in the ESG agenda around social impact?
Indeed, it's like joining that dots, isn't it?
It's joining the
internal
dots
and external rather than exclusively just looking internally and ignoring the external, having different people looking internal and external. And how about human rights and modern slavery in your work that you're doing with organisations and businesses?
So that agenda, we have been working with clients over the last 3 to 4 years. There's been a mix again of clients that want to understand their supply chain and human rights issues that may be out there. So we've gone in and we've audited, modern slavery statements just to look at what are organisations doing to mitigate the risks in their supply chain. All the way through to, undertaking reviews around ethical supply chains. So I would say it's mixed, but there is much more legislation that's out there now that's encouraging organisations to really reflect on their human rights activities across their supply chain and also internally within an organisation. So it's not going away. And we talk to clients around how can they put this on the agenda.
And also another question, how do you make those sustainable decisions on your supply chains? That is a question you must be asking your clients as well.
And we do. I mean, there's a variety of questions that we ask them around this supply chain challenges, because the supply chains are so complex, as Ollie talked about and as we saw in the video. And it's about constantly reviewing, constantly monitoring, not just doing one activity when you bring a supplier on board and then you move on to something else. It's about that constant review, monitoring.
As we said, supply chains are constantly changing and will continue to do so.
And will continue to do so.
Yeah.
And not doing anything isn't good enough.
Yeah. And actually, it's looking beyond just the E, isn't it, with ESG? And that's why that question about the S, I think, is really important, because often people stop at the E and forget about the S and the G. And that's why I'm hoping we've got some non-exec directors joining us so that boards get on board with it as such and
For sure.
look beyond the environmental side. So let's close the poll now, actually, and let's see what the results are. Does your business consider the S in terms of social impact in your supply chain? Yes, 63%. So the lion's share. Jackie, is that music to your ears?
Absolutely. And when I'm in talking to clients, it's around the narrative around that and how are they talking about that internally and externally. That's what I think organisations need to think about. How do they join that narrative up in terms of what is advertised internally and externally? So great to see 63%.
Yeah.
And it's just about constantly reviewing.
And of course, the audience not sure, which is interesting, actually, which is, I'm really pleased people have answered that, honestly, because actually it's thinking, well, I don't know.
But I think also some of that, as I've been talking to clients, it's about actually helping them understand that a lot of what they're doing in the S agenda in terms of social impact is actually tagged and is an ESG activity, whereas lots of conversations are, well, actually that's part of our culture initiatives. Actually, no, and culture is part of ESG. That's your governance piece. So it's about joining the dots, as you talked about earlier. It's that narrative and that constant narrative and joining it up. Re-tagging things is important as well.
Great. Well, thanks very much for doing those two polls. No further polls for this, but that's been really insightful for us, actually, as we move the conversation on. Thank you, Jackie. Dan, if I can bring you in now. Lots of regulation is following around all aspects of ESG. However, how do you feel if businesses are responding around taxations and legislation, staying with the S part of ESG, the social part?
Yeah, I mean, as a kind of general comment, tax runs right through the sustainability agenda of all businesses, especially a multinational business. Minor history lesson, but post the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009 was when the kind of external pressure on multinationals' tax affairs really ramped up. People actually became interested in what I did. Before that, they thought, I don't know, some sort of accountant, or I worked at HMRC or something, but actually my friends and family started asking a bit more because it really got into the kind of social and media consciousness, and like phrases like fair share of tax and all that sort of stuff became kind of common parlance, if you like. And, at that time, there's a lot of focus on the UK tax bill of multinationals, people looking at how much turnover they make in the UK and then sort of extrapolating how much tax they thought they should pay. But in terms of supply chains, there was also a lot of focus there on especially businesses where they were maybe using commodities that came from less developed nations. So there's minerals, oil and gas, food ingredients, all sorts of things like that. And actually, people started to look at, well, in that business, if it's UK headquartered, where's it getting its value from? Where is it paying tax? Where isn't it paying tax? And a lot of pressure on the amount of tax that was being paid in a less developed country compared to a European headquarters business that may coincidentally have a low rate of tax. Right, so there's a lot of pressure there, and that led to a lot more regulation. The UK has actually been at the forefront of a lot of this legislation, together with the EU. When we're part of the EU, we carried on those rules.
And legislation's growing in this area as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's things around, people I'm sure have heard about the country by country reporting rules that you have to deal with now, and that's essentially reporting your supply chain and reporting your profits, your people, your kind of substance in each country, and what tax you're paying, and let people sort of infer things from that. And those rules have been in place for a few years now. And actually, the EU's got a proposal from next year that will be publicly available, so that people can download that information. And then a couple of other things that the UK has been at the forefront of. There's something called, I'll get it right, the corporate criminal offence of failing to prevent tax evasion, basically. It takes a whole webinar to say the title, but the UK's come up with that. I think no one else has quite introduced it yet because it's too long to say, but this rule is essentially you have to, as a business, look at your global supply chain and all the links in it. So anything that's connected with you that's not necessarily legally part of your business. And if you don't have the procedures in place to try and stop tax evasion in the UK or any other country, and there is tax evasion, you can be potentially subject to an unlimited corporate criminal fine, and that's the thing that we're talking to a lot of clients about all the time, because it's very hard to monitor, and it's kind of the tax authorities putting that back on you to make sure that, as part of the S of an ESG agenda, that actually you as a corporate are making sure that the right amount of tax is being paid throughout your supply chain.
And it seems like a drive towards transparency.
Yeah, totally. It was interesting, 2008, 2009, the kind of transparency tended then to come from leaks to newspapers and things. So it was interesting as a kind of quite junior, employee at that time doing international tax, coming into the office every day and seeing newspapers putting up multinational slide decks and things like we do, and everyone's wondering where they came from. The whole Panama Papers stuff. I saw some of my clients on Panorama, things like that. That kind of led to governments saying, actually, we need to shine a light on this a lot more. And in the context of supply chains, it tends to be around fair tax, ethical supply chains, thinking about modern slavery, but also a contribution to an economy is more than just how you treat your employees. It's what tax you're paying on the business, and is that country getting its fair share of its resources. Yeah. Right.
And you talked about the corporate criminal offence of facilitating tax evasion as well. There's that focus on criminal investigations into seeking of the coronavirus support payments.
Yeah, it will do. That's a separate thing. HMRC have hired loads of people to follow up on those things.
Yeah.
And that is part of that whole agenda as well. That's this kind of separate team in HMRC looking at that.
And tax deferrals as well.
And the kind of reputational impact on your business on top of the cost of that investigation and any tax you have to pay can be huge and actually threaten the sustainability of your business, full stop.
Yeah, indeed. It's an important things that you've mentioned there. So yes, indeed. So remember to keep your questions and comments coming in via Slido, and we'll be going to your questions and comments in just a bit. Raj, you've been sitting there very quietly. Glad to see you're not wearing your martial arts outfit today. Now, to you, Raj, do organisations truly understand their impact on the environment, and how are they actually compiling data to understand this? And also, what is their confidence levels around that data collection?
No, it's a really good question. If we break that into its component parts, I think that would be a really good place to start. So we've spoken about TCFD and what it means and how it's impacting companies. But in a nutshell, looking at it from a very practical perspective, if you break that into three components, there's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Now, organisations are feeling more comfortable and confident with Scope 1 and 2, and those are emissions that are directly related to the products and services that they provide and they manufacture and they produce, and also the energy that goes into making those products and those services, and that includes sort of commuting, that includes company vehicles, that includes energy that they utilise to generate. That's both electricity and thermal energy and so forth. So those are elements that are within a company's and organisations' sort of four walls and control. So they see that through the energy bills, they see that through the amount of mileage they do, they see that through purchase orders, invoices, and a whole raft of data that they collect around that. So on that basis, they can almost control, and that they have that visuality of what they're spending, and then relaying that back to what that means in terms of carbon emissions. So the impact on the environment, i.e. for every megawatt of energy that you use, depending on the type of energy, it leads to the amount of sort of, tons of CO2 that is emitted. So relatively straightforward and simple, and a lot of organizations are doing that. Where it becomes more complex is Scope 3. And Scope 3 it's a beast in itself, in all fairness. And that looks at your upstream and downstream. So if you looked at a complex supply chain, and we've spoken about those, I mean, within a manufacturing sort of organization, you could have hundreds of suppliers that are feeding into you, depending on how complex your product and service is. Now, each one of those has its own emissions in terms of the services and products that they bring in, everything related to the distribution, the manufacturer, and so forth, even to the point of heating the buildings and the energy needed. So when you start accumulating all of that and what it means to the environment, it becomes massive. So if I was to put it into some focus, Scope 1 and 2 can be anything up to sort of 5 to 10% on average of the overall emissions, but Scope 3 is the remaining of that. So you're looking at 95 to potentially sort of 85% of all emissions relating to Scope 3. And the fact that for any organization, it's almost outside of their control. They're dependent on the organizations and the supply chain that's feeding into them. But that's upstream, but also downstream is after the product's left and their services has been delivered. What happens to that? At that point, in terms of what's needed, the energy that's needed that goes into operating that particular product, the waste that's generated, even to the point of when it goes to the end of its life, how it's recycled and the energy and the emissions that result from that. So it is vast, and so it depends what organizations are monitoring. Are they monitoring their internal within their four walls, or are they monitoring the overall impact of emissions from the products and services that they're providing? And this is the confidence level. So right now, a lot of organizations are focused on Scope 1 and 2 because of TCFD and reporting and issuing that analysis. Not so much on Scope 3. And Scope 3 is becoming more and more of a priority in terms of the size of the organization, the turnover of any organization as well. And it's becoming mandatory, and also the framework against which you report as well. Yeah. So it is very important, and with the more complex the supply chain, the sooner you have to start in terms of collecting the data, doing the analysis, and then being able to report on it. And that could take, like Gani said, 18 months, 3 years, maybe even longer, depending on the complexity.
And it's interesting that Scope 3, because like you said at the moment, that focus on larger organisations, but there will be a point when those larger organisations will expect the mid-market to play by the same rules, and expect them to report in that way. So it's not something that the mid-market can think, well, that doesn't affect me at the moment. It's being aware of it, like you said, Scope 1, Scope 2, the primary concern at the moment. But 3 is coming down the track fast, and it's better to be on the front foot, are you saying?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that statement. So when we're looking at Scope 1 and 2, so within that supply chain, the organisations will sort of assess what their Scope 1 and Scope 2 is, because they have to feed that back in within that supply chain. So that information is then passed to the OEMs and the end producer, because that will accumulate the overall Scope 3 for them, which is fantastic. But the cost in terms of being able to do that work, it identifies a vast array of information which generally organizations haven't been familiar with or haven't used, i.e. Growing energy costs right now, and that's a worldwide issue, and so a global supply chain is impacted rather than in any geographical location. But off the back of that, because of the energy that they're using and the type of energy and the source of that energy, that will lead to emissions. And coming back to Dan's point, and Dan will talk about this in a bit more detail, depending on the amount of emissions that are resulting, they have the carbon tax. So not only are you impacted by rising energy prices, you're also being impacted by the tax related to the carbon that you generate and that you put into the environment. So it's really important for an organisation to truly understand its complete impact on the environment outside of its four walls.
So the energy mix that they are currently using as well, that becomes even more important, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So looking at renewable energy and non-renewable energy will all have an impact on how you calculate your carbon tax, and moving away from, if it's more non-renewable energy, it will have a much bigger burden in terms of the emissions that you generate, and henceforth it's important to go to renewable, but at the same time it's not always practical. So there's a lot of organisations are doing, and they are focused on optimising, and coming back to Ollie's point in terms of optimising their processes, optimising their assets, trying to reduce the amount of energy that they're using, resulting in reduced energy costs and so forth. But to achieve, organisations which have a high energy consumption need to go through a transformation, and a transformation in the sense that going to assets which are less energy intensive, more efficient, and that is where the big strides and big changes are made in terms of the emissions themselves.
As we drive towards net zero by 2050, that will become even more paramount. But some of the actual targets are much sooner than that, in terms of whether it's electric vehicles, so petrol and diesel, to switch off those engines from 2035.
Yes.
So there are a few targets coming down the track, aren't there?
Absolutely.
And that helps businesses in a way. I suppose, if I was operating a mid-market business, I'd want to have some direction, as opposed to, well, actually don't leave it to us. If we have, say, the taxes and the legislation in place, then we know what we're playing towards.
Yeah. It's really important for any organisation to understand exactly where they are. So have a initial data point and a data set, and we call that baselining, in all fairness. Once they've developed that baseline data in terms of truly understanding what their energy and what their carbon emissions are internally, and also develop that for their scope 3, they then know where they can prioritise their efforts, what the key results are in terms of what the key contributors are to the environmental emissions, what the key contributors are towards energy, to cost, to tax, to social, and then they can focus that. And then from that, they can develop a roadmap, they can develop a strategy, they can develop KPIs, define their targets and define their measures, and they can always refer back to a starting position.
Thank you, Raj. Dan, so how does that reflect itself in the data and reporting when it comes to tax, based on everything we've just heard from Raj?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It's an evolving area and fast moving. I mean, as a summary, I'd say businesses just have to be aware that more and more carbon taxes are coming. And this isn't now just me boring Ollie about it. So it's actually happening, and I'm not really talking about kind of taxes on profits, like esoteric tax on profits or effective tax rate, or even like a windfall tax that's been talked about oil companies. I'm talking about above the line cost of goods that people aren't necessarily the businesses aren't necessarily factoring into their projections. Governments bring out these changes because transformation, the word Raj used, is really hard, costs money, right? And you look at it, and the polling question as well said only 7% of the respondents, I think, said they think it's cost saving, the things that they've done. So if that were true, and you look at that, you think, well, I might not bother, I won't bother, because it's costing me too much money to change. So governments have levers, both on the tax side and the incentive side, to sort of force change. And the main area in E, we can talk about plastics packaging tax, landfill tax, other waste taxes. They're important for certain businesses. Carbon taxes are the things that are going to impact every business. Japan last week, or week before, announced that they wanted to have a global carbon tax on shipping. And if you think about the current landscape we're in on supply chains, the shipping costs that people are suffering, the businesses are suffering from, that ultimately gets passed on to us to a certain extent if businesses are able to do that. This tax on shipping, carbon tax, will add another $60 billion a year or something onto global shipping costs if it comes in. And now that needs to be factored into businesses' long-term projections on their supply chains, because it really goes to the heart of whether they're sustainable or not. And it's about having a kind of weather eye on policy in the places where it's really important to your supply chain. So Raj talked about, people putting the data together, a kind of baseline, and working out where their emissions are, where they're coming from. Actually, what I'm advising clients on now is to look at those countries and think, actually, where is their policy going? I've had an Australian election this week, and it is basically a 180-degree about turn on an environmentally friendly, focused government coming in. And if you think about a supply chain there, you think, well, actually, loads of the world's iron ore comes from Australia. Right, $150 billion or something a year their exports on iron ore now. Iron ore feeds into steel, it ends up in your automotive company's cost base and all their supply chain, right? And you have to keep, what we're advising people to do is look at where policies are going in countries and factor that in.
Yeah, indeed. And you talked about several taxes that have just been introduced, like the packaging one. I think that came in April, didn't it, 2022? Right, yeah. And right. There are some exemptions there. But again, I bet there's quite a few businesses that don't realise what their obligations are.
No, that's right. And it's not just UK businesses, it's overseas businesses importing stuff into the UK as well. And I think the other thing on carbon I wanted to mention is what the EU is doing around that. Yeah. So there's something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which effectively is a tax on scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So if you're a business that's importing certain products into the EU, from next year, you first need to register under this regime. And then you need to start making calculations to understand what your embedded carbon emissions are in that product that you're bringing across the border into the EU. It's meant to level up the playing field for EU producers of certain products versus producers in countries who don't quite have the same carbon tax or carbon pricing mechanism. And that is a thing that's going to add loads of cost to businesses and loads into supply chains. If you think about, let's say, an automotive company in the UK and the EU, iron ore comes from Australia, policies might change in Australia, might be more cost there. You stick it on a ship to China, more cost there because of the tax on shipping. Goes to China, change into steel, imported into the EU, carbon border adjustment mechanism, more tax to pay there. You add up all those extra costs, quite quickly get to a credible position where businesses aren't sustainable anymore because of the extra costs in their supply chain.
And it's very complicated, isn't it, to navigate. I mean, global standards would make it so much easier, wouldn't it? Which we are in some areas seeing.
It would make it a lot easier. I mean, but in tax, you very rarely get global agreement on anything because countries, they make all the right noises about things, but then ultimately they kind of fall back on what's their own agenda and what's better for them. From an accounting point of view, Raj was mentioning TCFD. The ISSB is a new body that's been formed by the Accounting Standards Body, and they're trying to get at least some sort of commonality and standards about reporting scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And that would help a lot because you'd be collecting that data for that purpose, and then you'd be able to see with a better weather eye where your carbon tax.
Can you spell out that acronym? Do you know? I'm really putting you on the spot here.
The
ISSB? The International
Standard Setting Body, I think.
Yeah, OK, so answers on a postcard to that one, OK.
It's part of the International Financial Reporting Council that's been set up. So.
And that will help, actually, drive those global standards, which, again, it's people operating international businesses. And even if you're not, though, having a global standard certainly helps. So I think that's going to be a very positive step, which will make a difference. Well, actually, thank you very much. That's inspired quite a few questions coming in already. And actually, if you like a particular question, then you can vote your like. I don't think you can vote your own question that you like it, but if the audience watching like a particular question that's been posed by another audience member, then you're welcome to do that. And one that's caught my eye straight away is one for you, Ollie. How are people looking at cost optimisation given all the uncertainty? Ollie, what are you seeing from manufacturing clients?
Great question. So lots of innovation. That's the first thing. I'm going to touch a bit on Dan's answer too, because we've talked a lot about sort of the tax side there. But there's also huge amounts going on around innovation. We're seeing cost downs in lots of different things. So a great example, we've been talking to lots of R&D companies recently. Brilliant one yesterday, talking about the way they would use hydrogen and the way that they could transport it much more easily. Another company we spoke to recently talked about shipping and marine engines. So you talk about the cost of shipping. They're looking at that, and they're looking at how can you use hydrogen and something to mix that together to then create a much better or environmentally friendly ship to reduce the emissions. we're seeing huge levels of innovation. Same with trucks and buses and engines and old diesel engines, similar sorts of things. We see lots in the battery market too. There are more companies than you'd be able to find quickly on the internet that are looking at this. And there's some fantastic UK businesses in particular that are market leaders in battery technology, also using them for aeroplanes as well. That's coupled with the incentives and grants that are available. There's about £1 billion worth of what's called the Automotive Transformation Fund that's available. There's another, just short of another £1 billion that's available for hydrogen, nuclear and other technologies as well. So we're seeing lots of exciting businesses taking advantage of those to really tackle some of these issues that are coming into the market.
So actually, talking about the automotive sector, if your company is international, they want to invest in the UK, how important is ESG in the investment strategy?
We've seen that really change. If you'd asked that question to me maybe 5 years ago, I would have said that lots of business plans have a throwaway page at the back with some strategy around recycling or similar. Now, there's whole chapters. It's really become an important part of the conversation. It's become an important part of the conversation because people are really interested in it and see that if I'm going to invest, as an investor, I want to make sure that in the future my business is something that's sustainable. So how am I going to tackle recycling? How am I going to tackle waste goods? What sort of emissions have I got? How am I going to tackle social issues? Jackie mentioned it earlier, and as did Dan, about different materials and metals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, all coming from lots of different countries around the world in some very challenging areas. And they've got to have a strategy to be able to answer the question is, where's that coming from and what am I doing in that local area to ensure that it's the best product in a holistic way and not just the physical product in itself.
And that's why recycling of precious metals is so important now.
It absolutely is. And there's brilliant new technologies, again, in the UK that's coming forward to help recycle some of these products. There's new recycling facilities. There's one in Kent and there's one in the Midlands in particular that we've spoken to. Fantastic places that are really pushing the boundaries of what you can extract from batteries and other materials.
Indeed, I think people haven't realised we've been sitting on gold mines, quite literally, some precious metals in our phones and computers that we've discarded and actually realise they have a value beyond the life that we thought they did.
And also they've got additional value too. So lots of car batteries, for example, are being recycled now into storage batteries. Not easy to handle, but again, new technologies coming to help manage that too.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got another question. Thank you, Neil, for this question. Neil Tyson, how is hybrid working impacted on measurement of energy usage and its sources? Could we see this leading to an increase in emissions for some organisations? And that's quite an interesting question, actually, from Neil. Who wants that one, particularly as we've been working, more from home, and hybrid working does seem to be the norm, depending on what industry you're in. But actually, is it being measured properly to see the impact? Who wants that one?
I'm happy to
Jackie, go for it.
But it'd be great to have the panel joining in. So we do quite a lot of work with clients around hybrid working. One, because, as you say, it's becoming the norm, and organisations and individuals are enjoying the flexibility and the productivity levels are increasing or staying the same. So it's here to stay, I would argue. Therefore, if that is now the new norm, one has to then consider the hybrid working as part of the supply chain. Yeah. So how do you then, as an organisation, monitor and manage that in terms of the carbon footprint? And I would say it's early days for organisations to really tap into that. I know internally within Grant Thornton, we're actively reviewing that, and our sustainability team are having great conversations about how do we measure that. So I think it's early doors, but it's something that we'll have to keep working through in terms of what and how do we measure. Like any organisation, it's another vein of carbon footprint that you have to consider, put in place activity, measures, processes to understand the numbers.
And isn't that included in the scope as well?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
That.
So looking at it very simply, if you're not commuting or if you're not using a vehicle, which burns fuels and fossil fuels, then you're minimising the impact of the environment. very simple statement, and that's great. But you can break that down into two phases: direct sort of operational staff, which do have to go in as part of the manufacturing and so forth. So there's still going to be an element to that, and then the more sort of indirect, sort of staff and social elements in terms of that are office based, which can have that flexibility in terms of working. So it does impact, and we've seen an initial sort of improvement or reduction in CO2 down to that, but it depends what proportion of that commuting it contributes to your overall emissions as well.
And I'm just thinking the government, the paper they produced, 2050 net zero, I'm sure that was mentioned as well, remote working or home working, wasn't it? So it is being... Ollie, I think, did you want to say something?
I was only going to say about boilers. Gas boilers are one of the big trends that's going to come in the next few years, removing those because there's a huge level of emissions. I want to say it's about 15 or 20% of the total emissions in the country come from gas boilers. So we're going to be removing those, we're going to be changing for electric or other solutions. And that's impacted by home working.
Yeah. And there are financial incentives, aren't there, depending on where you live. But OK, fine. OK, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Got a question from Paul Gooch. Thank you very much, Paul. And considering the huge scope of ESG, is it only the big corporations that can afford the top talent and expertise to effectively manage the challenges? Oh, I like that question, Paul. Who wants that one? Who wants to have a go?
I'm happy
Go on, Ollie.
happy to start that one off.
Don't fight over it.
It's a great question. It is a really good question. And I think that's the challenge for lots of mid-market businesses, because mid-market businesses have some unique offerings as far as recruitment and retention that larger businesses maybe cannot offer. You've got lots of great opportunities, and you've got to advertise those as a mid-market. So some of those are maybe non-financial benefits that retain and attract people. And there are probably financial benefits there too, because you would hope that you'd be able to accelerate their careers as well in a small business as you would in a large business.
And let's not forget the mid-markets is that engine of the UK economy, and is a brilliant, like you said, for those flexible opportunities that you may not get in the larger organisations, that chance to grow.
Absolutely. Exposure to senior people is brilliant in mid-market firms. And you get a whole range of offers, and you're not siloed into maybe one function either. So it's about how mid-market businesses sell themselves at the minute. And
we're talking, what, 50 to 500 million turnover, aren't we, when we're thereabouts? OK, brilliant. Jackie?
Perfect. He went in and took all the words out, but no, seriously. The only thing I would add to that is the flexibility and the speed at which the mid-market can put things in place. You know, the innovation point that you talked about, you know, we've talked to a number of clients recently around circular economies within their own organisations. So there are some great opportunities to tap into, get involved in some of the supply chain activities. So, and the speed at which the mid-market can put these offers on the table is quite attractive for the talent. But it's just about that narrative piece that we talked about earlier, but also as we've talked about here now, around how are you advertising that? How are you communicating internally and externally to the market around the opportunities?
Yeah.
That's what organisations need to be doing.
Indeed, as often they don't have the time and the resources, do they, to do that. But actually, if you put aside that effort for that internal and external joining the dots, that attracts the talent because they like what you're doing.
And if you look at LinkedIn, it's becoming very busy at the moment around what organisations are doing and trying to attract people. So it doesn't necessarily rest with a comms function. Any leader should be out there talking about the stuff they're doing.
Dan's nodding away there. Does that mean you want to speak, Dan?
No, I'm just thinking about any kind of investment you might make on the ESG journey and agenda, whether it is an investment in talent or new technology or whatever. It feels expensive and it feels like it's going to cost money, and it feels like when's it going to pay back. I think to Ollie's point earlier, as a business, you've got to look for all the pay-fors out there. So Ollie mentioned incentives, grants, in the tax system, R&D, capital allowances, all that stuff. We find a lot of business. We spoke to one recently, an inbound business that hadn't factored in any of the potential grants or tax savings they could get in investing in a new plant in the UK into their cost-benefit decision. And if we hadn't spoke to them, the UK would have looked like a bad answer, which is bad for the UK economy, bad for employment, bad for everything. So just think holistically about all the pitfalls you can get, I would say.
Yeah, good point there. I've got a question from Brian Hardwick. How do you gather ESG data from suppliers and consumers who may be upstream or downstream positions away from you in the chain? So who may be several upstream or downstream positions away from you in the chain. So I'll read that again from Brian. How do you gather ESG data from suppliers and consumers who may be several upstream or downstream positions away from you in the chain? And that's obviously got quite a few likes there as well. It's up on the leaderboard there.
Yep, I'll take that one.
Thank you, Raj.
Around data. There's multiple ways in which you can do it, but looking at it from a simplistic perspective, depends on the relationships that you do have with your upstream and downstream supply chain. But a good way is questionnaires. So having a questionnaire which you can send out to your supply chain. There's no guarantee that you'll get all the answers back, but that will identify where the gaps are within the data and within the analysis, and it will help you understand your risks, because that is a big part of risk, and also help you work with that supply chain to fill in those gaps. And then you can use proxy data depending on where they are globally, depending on the operations that they do. There's standard elements of data that you can put in there, but ideally you want to move away from proxy data into actual data. So questionnaires, interviews, talking to the right teams within the organizations as part of your upstream and downstream to collect that data, identify where the missing gaps are, and help them fill those gaps in.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope you like that answer, Brian. Jackie, I've got one for you. How hard is it to understand the supply chain and each level of supplier with respect to their practices to protect human rights and labour standards?
Great question. And again, it depends on the organisation and the level of complexity of that organisation. So it's a mixed response in terms of how difficult it is. Arguably, though, it is easier to understand your tier one suppliers, those people that are directly supplying to you. But again, that becomes more complex as your tier one suppliers are not within country, they're across international borders. So understanding what their makeup is important, but it's more complex to be able to do. Picking up on Raj's point around questionnaires, yes, you can give that to them. Physically going on site and having a look at them. If you're here in the UK, doing that over in China is less easy, but there are organisations that can do that for you. So there's some due diligence around understanding your activity across your tiers. If you go further down into your tiers, in 2, 3, and 4, the suppliers of your supplier, it becomes more complex. So you have to use a variety of tools that Raj has talked about to really unpick the makeup of your supply chain. And you have to build and grow processes to do that right here, right now, because the supply chain, as we've talked about in this last hour, is so complicated. And we go into clients and ask them to identify, what are your tier one suppliers? And you don't always get the response, well, here's my spreadsheet that tells you all of that. Sometimes they don't have that data. And it's about, you need that data. You need to be able to go down into the food chain to understand the makeup. And the legislation that's coming is not going to allow organisations to sit back and not understand their supply chain.
Yeah, it goes back to transparency. It's a good thing for businesses.
I think it's great, absolutely great, and especially within, the human rights or labour standards activity. And, the example that you talked about earlier, Dan, around, you start in Australia, it goes to China, then it comes into Europe. That's a hugely complex beast, and you need to understand the human rights and the labour standards of all of those different territories.
Yeah, we've got a great question here as well about the impact with SMEs, with mid-markets engaging. So the question came in, it's got quite a few likes here. What will be your advice on engaging and collaborating with small, less resourceful suppliers, the SMEs, on integrating ESG into their respective supply chains? Now, don't all jump in at once. Who wants that one? Ollie?
Yeah, I'll start picking that one up. Just on the last question, just a really quick bit to add, because it adds into this one too, which is around some of these ESG-related questions that are being asked in the supply chain can be quite business critical as well. So they're really important to all businesses, whether they're small or medium, or even the large ones. A brilliant example was a tsunami in Japan, maybe 10 years ago now. That took out a factory that couldn't produce for a long period of time, that made white paint, or the pigment that was used in white paint in cars, which meant that no cars could be made with white paint over a period of time afterwards. So no one actually knew this in the automotive industry. They didn't realise that all the roads led to this particular factory that caused this particular problem. So knowing those tiers and knowing what's down is actually really important for all businesses, because there's always a risk in there somewhere that you need to consider. So I'd flip that question round and say, why would they not do it? It's because there are risks to not doing it.
So understanding your risk, that's another interesting fact, actually. You should have told Rita Ora that one. She would have been a good conversation starter. Now, that's fascinating, isn't it? To think that impact without people realising that. And actually, I suppose in a way, the last 2 years has focused on people wanting to bring supply chains closer to home in many ways, hasn't it? That people are looking to not rely on territories abroad and maybe rely on more homegrown supply chains, which is not always practical, is it?
No, but this is a big trend at the minute. Some people call it nearshoring or bringing stuff in towards Europe, whatever the buzzword is. But we're seeing, over the last couple of years, lots of cost increases in the supply chain, lots of container costs, shipping costs, etc. Lots more inventory, as we mentioned at the start. And that's caused more costs throughout and actually increasing people's cost per unit. So we're seeing now is people starting to look at bringing work closer to the UK, not necessarily in the UK, but certainly areas around Europe, considering lots of different countries such as Poland, Turkey, even North Africa are great areas to relocate. And a good example is, I think it was 75% of the manufacturing businesses in the survey were looking to do this as well. But you then start opening up lots of ESG-related questions. So, okay, if I'm going to relocate to Germany or Poland or Turkey as examples, which ones I want to relocate to, they've all got their positives, and actually some have surprising issues they need to deal with. So Germany uses a tremendous level of fossil fuel still. And when you compare that to Turkey, it actually uses more fossil fuels per head than Turkey.
Yeah.
So
that was a decision to switch off all nuclear, though, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So they've made a decision, but it impacts people's... it impacts down the line into some of these supply chain decisions. So you've got to take all of these things into account when you're looking at what's best for your business and where you're looking to relocate some of your supply chain.
Right, just conscious of time, actually, because we've got about another 10 minutes. I'm just going to quickly do another question, maybe a couple, before we have our final thought. So, is it possible to have a Plan B supply chain as companies can go bust? So a quick response from somebody on that one.
Yes. I think in some cases you have to look at the risk. That's the important bit. Yeah. Be able to categorise the risk. A lot of the car companies are struggling with that at the moment. Wire harnesses are a brilliant example. There's over 3.5 miles of wire, a harness that goes into a car. There were 11 factories in Ukraine. And we're not going to comment on, obviously, the geopolitical issues in the area, but the practical issue is that those companies have had to relocate some of that manufacturing. So yes, you do. I think in some cases you look at the risk, know where your highest risks are, and then have to factor that cost in.
Yeah, I think with anything, well, I think about when I deal with crisis comms, you always got to have a plan B. So the same for supply chains as well, isn't it? You don't rely on your plan A, a plan B, even a plan C. There we go, I think we're going to need. Very quickly, another question from Neil. Neil Tyson, you've been prolific today, so thank you very much. How important do you consider an organisation's anti-bribery and corruption programme to be in its ESG strategy? So not just the G, but also the E and the S.
I can take that. I mean, it's enormous, right? I mean, it's linked to yeah, you're right. I mean, not just the amount of you can look up some fines, right, and see how much some companies have been fined and the sort of reputational damage they get. It's linked to some of the things I talked about before within the tax agenda about the reputational impacts that can happen if you get caught out by one of these things. And so I think it should be right at the top of a board's agenda, NEDs, it should be right up there to make sure that this is being dealt with. Not just from a kind of selfish, this could make my business look bad, but it's not the right way to be operating business anyway, right? It's good. It's how we should think about things these days, not just the kind of that it harms my reputation if I get caught out. It's the right way to operate, and increasingly, a myriad of stakeholders are just more interested in what you're doing in your business. Full stop. So, I know we've got a few financial services businesses tuned into this, and actually, banks and private equity funds thinking about the investments they're going to make, lending, buying, whatever it is. Actually, if you don't have correct anti-bribery procedures, that's going to be a big minus point on a decision to lend you money or buy you as a business.
Yeah.
So that's important, and all this feeds into those stakeholders thinking as well.
And the Bribery Act, I mean, the UK really set the tone for the Bribery Act. It was first implemented here and has been here for a number of years.
That's right,
it?
yeah. And, and we're seeing, businesses really take it seriously. I mean, there's been fines issued in the hundreds of millions of pounds, never mind the reputational damage, and so, it's critical, and the UK is at the forefront of it, but all of the countries are following us as well.
Indeed, sort of set the tone. That we already had a very high bar in comparison to many other countries, but we certainly set the tone there. But it's an interesting question. Thank you very much for that. Finally, I have a question for all the speakers, and really it's to sort of reflect on what we've spoken about, those sort of key considerations that you'd like the audience to think about or act upon once we've finished the broadcast here today. So, Jackie, can I start with you? So what are the key considerations you'd like to impart about, changing supply chains and everything else we've spoken about?
If there's one thing that I would ask you to do is to look at if you qualify for a modern slavery statement in terms of the size of your business, go in, read it, see whether or not there is substance behind it, and if not, go back to your executive team and explore the issues. If you don't qualify in terms of your size of business to put a modern slavery statement out there, just think about the UN Global Compact principles around modern slavery, labour standards, initiatives within your organisation. And just ask yourself that question: what are you doing internally to mitigate human rights issues and labour standards issues?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I know you know all about the UN Global Compact principles. So, if you want any more information on that, we'll share contact details later on, Jackie. But well said, Raj. Same to you. So, those key considerations you'd like the audience to think about, act upon.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I want to keep it really simple. Truly understand what your organisation is doing in terms of the impact on the environment. And that's not only in emissions, but also looking at water resilience, looking at power, looking at carbon emissions and all the other emissions that are related to it. But it's not enough just to do that within your four walls. Understand what the bigger implication is across your whole value and supply chain, and let it be data-driven. And also support the supply chain. We've sort of addressed all the risks associated with the supply chain as well, but it's the responsibility of everyone to make the environment a better place and also understand what their impact is to the environment. So I think that is a key takeaway statement.
And that helps improve communication, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and reduce risk as well.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you very much, Dan. Same to you, please.
Yeah, I think just building off what Raj was saying, I mean, you'll be collecting a lot of data around your supply chain around the world for lots of different reasons, reporting, cost reduction, whatever it is. And for me, with the tax hat on, it would be having a weather eye on the policy direction in the key countries in your supply chain. Where's it going? Where are costs going to bite me? Building that into the long-range plan that you've got. And building in some sensitivity as well. Say, if X country copies Y country, is my supply chain still sustainable or not with that extra cost in the business? Like, sounds very simple, but it's a hard thing to do. You have to go through it based on data and also based on a bit of a kind of crystal ball gazing as well in those countries. I think that's the key takeaway for me, because this sort of agenda will really threaten the sustainability of businesses. That's the cost side. On the pay-for side, I think take away the fact that, I think Ollie mentioned it first, that this agenda's hard to implement. It feels like it costs lots of money, but there are lots of pay-fors out there that you should take account of and build in and try and take advantage for, whether it's apprenticeship levy, R&D reliefs, grants from governments to set up in free ports, whatever it is. So they're the two key takeaways, I'd say.
Indeed, and how about ensuring that your suppliers are doing the same? Is that a bit too much to expect?
No, I mean, I don't think it is. I think I've seen that a lot from big businesses, and also banks as well, because like I said, they want to know that they're lending money to someone who's a good a good borrower, right? And the good borrower these days doesn't just look at that business. It has to look through the whole supply chain all the way down and making sure that it's resilient, all the costs are estimated, you know what's going to happen. So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Ollie?
So I think that my point today is going to be that it's very overwhelming, I think, for a lot of businesses. We've talked about so many subjects here today, and it's using a bit of Dan's and a bit of Raj's, really. Keep it really simple. List all of the things that's going to give you the biggest benefit or is the biggest risk, and try and tackle them in some sort of order. Try and prioritise them so that you can work your way through, because you cannot solve everything overnight. It does take time, but there are massive benefits. And some of those benefits include reduced costs from lenders. There are real financial benefits out there. But again, keep it simple, keep it on a page, and you'll get much bigger buy-in from your teams as well, if you can identify some of those things that will make a difference to them.
And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to make large investments to make those changes, does it?
No, again, use your prioritisation. Look for the ones which have got less investment but a higher impact, again, in terms of risk or opportunity, and work your way through. As you say, it doesn't have to have massive investment. They can be really impactful, and it's great for the reputation and finances of the business in most cases.
And there isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of template. The starting point, I assume, is going to be different for each business.
It is. And one of the things we do is we sit down with a workshop, we work through 100-odd different issues, and we try and help businesses pick out which ones do you want to tackle first. And it's the thinking behind it that's the important bit, and knowing why you're tackling that particular item. Again, it gets big buy-in from your teams, and that buy-in then translates into action, and actually people really enjoy working on that type of thing.
Yeah, makes it very sort of practical, and I like that idea, those simple, practical approaches, rather than thinking, oh gosh, I've got to solve everything in one go. Well, thank you very much for those sort of key sort of points. I think they're very useful for the audience to contemplate and consider. And Ollie, if anybody wants to find out further information, get the speaker details, or find out more from you four or anybody else within Grant Thornton, what's the best way forward?
There should be a slide on the screen right now, so with some contact details. Please feel free to get in contact with us if you've got any questions, or with your contact, who I'm sure has put you in contact with this webinar as well.
So plenty of people within Grant Thornton that they can get in contact with, including your good selves as well. And just so you know, actually, a recording of this broadcast will be made available in the next few days. You'll get an email confirming when that's ready to view. So you can watch it all again or share it with your colleagues, because we've covered, haven't we, so much breadth and depth, and hopefully given you some really good practical ideas, and to think about actually where should we start, or how can we improve our ever-changing supply chains. So I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast. I want to thank all four speakers today. So thank you very much to Ollie Bridge, Head of Operational Consulting at Grant Thornton, to Jackie Griffiths, Lead for People, Culture and ESG at Business Risk Services, Dan Dickinson, Tax Partner from Grant Thornton, and also from Grant Thornton, of course, Raj Kumar, Head of Environmental Advisory. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for all your questions and comments throughout today, and for taking part in the polls. It's been most insightful. Thank you for your time today, and I wish you all the best in your sustainable supply chain journey. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.